I'm Dr. Alexis Artwohl. I'm a retired clinical and police psychologist specializing in trauma. I'm still doing training with law enforcement and with citizens on some of the psychological and emotional issues involved with use of deadly force and the implications for your physical, legal, and emotional survival. And today we're going to be talking about a variety of issues that can impact your survival in those three areas. What I'd like to talk about now is some of the cognitive issues that can happen during an event, because these things are important not only for your emotional survival, they will become very critical to your legal survival. Most of us going around thinking that we have good memories, and that's actually not true. Research has shown that while we may often have a reasonably coherent memory of the gist of the situation, research shows that our ability to have an accurate memory of the details of an event is in fact quite impaired. Most of us don't realize how bad our memory for detail really is, simply because we're almost never challenged on it. Nobody really cares that our memory for detail of our daily life is in fact quite sketchy, full of gaps, and is very inaccurate. If you get involved in an incident and they're now wanting a statement from you and you choose to give one, all of a sudden the criminal justice system is going to become intensely interested in the details of the situation. The details of your recollection if you choose to give a statement, the details of the recollection of any eyewitnesses to the event is going to come into play. And it's important for you and who's ever legally representing you to understand that eyewitness testimony, including your own, is notoriously unreliable. That people, again, they may get the gist, but your memory can be full of memory gaps. You won't remember parts of the event. There will be some of your own behavior that you will be unaware of and you won't remember. This can even include complex, purposeful behavior. In working with police officers, I've worked with officers who in the middle of a gunfight had a gun jam, they cleared the jam, they reloaded their weapon, they emptied that magazine, they reloaded again, and when the whole thing was over with, they have no memory of any of that. They just assumed that they were firing rounds out of their first magazine. They have no idea that they had reloaded and cleared a jam and all of those sorts of issues. I've talked to officers who have made phone calls during an event to their family members, and they don't remember doing that. And you think, well, there's no way you could pick up a phone, call your family member to say, I just called to tell you I love you, hang up the phone, call another family member, do the same thing, and you have no memory of doing that. But I had that happen to an officer in a high-speed pursuit where he believed that the felon had almost killed him. And during this high-speed pursuit, he was actually making phone calls to his family members. And you're thinking, well, that's crazy. Why would somebody do that? And he doesn't know because he has zero memory of making those phone calls. But I firmly believe that the reason he was doing that is his subconscious mind had told him, that guy almost killed you. If you don't make it out of this alive, you need to call your family members and tell them that you love them. And that's exactly what he did. This illustrates the complexity of our mind in the different levels that we can operate at, where we can be consciously focused on doing something over here, but our subconscious mind is actually directing a whole separate subroutine of us doing other things on the side that we're completely unaware of, and we have no memory of doing that. Often the criminal justice system is naive about how complex the mind can really be. There's often this disconnect between the demands of the criminal justice system and the complexity of how the brain operates. Even behavioral scientists, we're still really in our infancy of understanding, trying to understand how human memory works. Most of it is a mystery to us, even now. But there are some things that are pretty obvious based on the current research, and one of those is that our memory for detail often is highly inaccurate. People can also have completely false memories during these events. They can be absolutely convinced that something happened and it didn't happen at all, or happens dramatically differently than the way that they remember it. There are many different reasons for this. Let's talk about some of those issues like Selective attention is one of the biggies. Selective attention simply means that we often think that we're paying attention to everything that's going on around us. Absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. We have decades and decades of research of showing that whether we're doing it consciously or subconsciously, we're only paying attention to a very small part of our environment at any point in time. So if our conscious attention is focused on, let's say, event A, and the more compelling that particular event A is, the more we're going to be focused on that and the less we're going to notice what's going on around us. And that's called inattentional blindness. You can actually be looking right at something and not see everything that's going on around it and behind it and to the side and so on and so forth. You can be looking at a person's face and had a 10-minute conversation with them, and someone could come along right after that and say, tell me what color their shirt was, and you would have no idea because it wasn't relevant. We simply weren't paying any conscious attention to it. We were much more focused on the expression on the person's face or what we were trying to tell them or their reactions to the story we were telling them. So that's a very, very common phenomenon. It doesn't happen just in a high-stress event. It happens to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We are having selective attention where we are paying attention only to certain things. Those things that we're consciously paying attention to, we're more likely to remember, although there's certainly no guarantee. And the other stuff that we are not consciously paying attention to, we may never remember because it never got into our brain in the first place. So that's selective attention. The same thing can apply with hearing, where if we're not actively listening for something, there can be sounds going on in our environment that we are completely oblivious to. Research has shown, for instance, that if you give someone a visual task to perform, and they're now performing this visual task, the part of their brain that processes visual information becomes a lot more active, just like you would expect. But what's interesting is the part of their brain that processes sound, the auditory cortex, actually becomes less active. The inference being that the brain is not only paying far more attention to vision, but it's also paying a lot less attention to sound so that you don't hear it. And this phenomenon of what we call auditory exclusion or diminished sound is very common in these extreme stress events. For instance, officers involved in shootings often don't hear gunfire, they don't hear loud sirens, they don't hear people screaming. I've worked with people who've been in car wrecks. They said the car wreck, which of course is an extremely noisy event, they said it was silent. They couldn't hear the crunching of the metal, the breaking of the glass. They felt like everything was happening in slow motion. They may not hear some sounds at all. Other sounds might sound extremely amplified for some reason. So there's all kinds of very strange perceptual issues that happen in these events that can really cause people to get confused about exactly what happened, and it can really impact their memory. So that's one of the things to remember is if you do choose to give a statement, don't be surprised if your memory simply doesn't match the physical evidence, the accounts of other eyewitness testimonies, videotapes, et cetera, et cetera. That is actually pretty common. If you do decide to give a statement and you're being interviewed, it's very important that you stick with what you know and don't feel pressured to fill in the gaps to please the interviewer. The interviewer will want details. You don't know what kind of training they have. A well-trained interviewer will be careful to ask questions in such a way that they're not encouraging you to try to fill in the gaps and make up things. But sometimes subtle pressure can be brought, not necessarily intentionally, but simply because the interview technique was not optimal. And you need to not feel any social pressure inside yourself or pressure from the interviewer to start filling in the gaps, because there's a strong temptation for us to do this. Our minds do not like memory gaps, so we will have a strong tendency to think the mind to go say, well, it probably happened this way, so that's what I'm going to fill in the gap with. Well, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, you just don't know. So obviously you want to be 100% truthful, but also realize that your truth may or may not match reality.